Mary Jane Watson has to be one of the most patient and understanding comic book romantic partners, especially in the face of suffering various adversities and traumas because of her relationship with Peter Parker. Even when Peter snaps at her or lies to her, she always tries to be supportive and understanding, which is pretty impressive considering all the shit she's been through. Welcome back, Nerd Squad. Today we're going to revisit some of the darker and more cruel moments that MJ has suffered in comics as we count down the top 10 worst things that happened to Mary Jane. From problematic relationship moments to just plain old tragic storytelling, there is a lot to cover here, so let's get counting. Number 10. Childhood trauma. You might think Peter has some pretty intense childhood trauma himself, and he does, but he's not alone here. MJ also had a rough childhood. She grew up in a home where her family was constantly forced to move because her dad, a professor, always felt the need to take on new jobs and move to new schools. Maybe because he had an anger problem, or as MJ speculated, because he was looking for some kind of satisfaction that he never really could find. This made it hard for MJ to make new friends, but she forced herself to be even more outgoing and charismatic, entertaining her classmates and making everyone fall in love with her. That classic MJ charm. However, what her friends didn't know was at home she and her sister Gail and her mom were suffering. Her father mistreated them and even at one point attacked Gail in front of Mary Jane. Eventually, her mother left her father, but I don't think MJ ever really healed from her trauma, instead choosing to use her love of performing as a creative outlet and a means of escape. Number 9. Losing her mom. Not only did Mary Jane have a difficult life growing up, but she also lost her mother at a young age, after her father had disappeared from her life, and right around the time her sister had her husband walk out on her, while she was pregnant with their last child. Oh my goodness. The death of her mom took a toll on MJ and served as a wake-up call. Feeling her mother and her sister had both wasted their lives, giving up on their passions to become mothers, she left her sister, moving in with her Aunt Anna in Brooklyn, and decided to pursue her own dreams of becoming a professional actress. And before we move on to our next spot, just a quick little reminder to give that like a little click. It really helps us out on the channel, and thank you so much if you've already done so. Number 8. Killed by love. This one only ranks lower because it is technically from an alternate future, but it's still pretty terrible. In Spider-Man Reign, Mary Jane dies young after getting cancer, which despite it also being implied with her mom to run in her family in terms of her medical history, it is in this case caused by her closeness to Peter Parker himself and all his radioactive fluids. In the end, Peter's radioactivity is the one to blame for Mary Jane's death, and she lives on in his memories, haunting him. We also need to acknowledge how unkind, senile old Peter is to ghost memory MJ, because that is also very much a thing in Spider-Man Reign. In typical Peter fashion, he seems to almost take out his own feelings of guilt on her ghost, having more than a few outbursts that are directed at MJ's non-existent self. Number 7. Suffered Peter Parker's hostility. There are multiple times that Mary Jane has suffered being emotionally mistreated by Peter, but this moment in retrospect for me is one of the worst. Just after Gwen died, Peter was caught tearfully mourning her by MJ, who had been waiting in Harry and Pete's apartment. She was in a lot of pain at the time, having just heard of Gwen's death and mourning her basically best friend Gwen herself. Peter, however, did not want to hear it and insisted his pain was actually greater than hers and that she couldn't possibly understand how hurt he was. Wow, what a cruel and immature way to respond. Like, I know Peter was hurting, but ouch! MJ did not deserve this. He also goes on to say, "Don't make me laugh, Mary Jane. You wouldn't be sorry if your own mother died." Whew. This stings quite a bit given what we now know of MJ's past, that Mary Jane's mother did die, and that it was extremely painful for her. Granted, Peter might not have known this yet, in fact I'm pretty sure he didn't in terms of continuity, but still, ouch! I'm sure when he found out about that later, he thought back to those words and was like, oh, I was pretty terrible, that was bad. I hope he apologized to her later. Number 6. Fan hate. The fan hate that we see by some is actually seen as being created somewhat by Marvel's hate for her character, depending on who we talk to. So what's really going on here? Why do people hate MJ? Well, there are Spider-Man fans who blame Mary Jane almost exclusively for Gwen's death. Not like a conspiracy theory like, Mary Jane was secretly the Green Goblin or anything weird like that. It's more just that MJ basically caused Gwen to be killed because writers wanted MJ and Peter to be together together, and many fans actually would have rather that he stayed with Gwen, who they think is a more suitable fit. So the way they see it, if MJ wasn't around, Gwen would still be around today. Then there are those who criticize her fancy-free lifestyle and just how she's kinda all about having fun. People didn't think that she was serious enough, though really with the context of her history, it's kinda hard to see how people felt this was like a problem. Like, that's kinda just part of Mary Jane's characterization, and it makes sense if you know her history. Then there are those who feel she simply isn't well enough written, that she's basically an underdeveloped character without really much depth. Regardless, there is a lot of hate that gets thrown MJ's way that I think in most cases is very undeserved. Let me know what you folks think of this hate in the comments. Number 5. Had her marriage retconned. While this is pretty bad, her relationship with Peter Parker hasn't been all that great, which is why I'm ranking this one so low. Given all that MJ has gone through during her marriage, it might be better honestly if it never happened. Although I'm sure Mary Jane's love of Peter would prevent her from ever agreeing with me. Because yeah, that love is pretty strong, Tiger. Mary Jane and Peter's marriage was the price that Spider-Man was asked to pay Mephisto in exchange for his help in saving Aunt May's life. Rather than let his elderly Aunt May pass away, Peter agreed. Which is pretty crazy considering, you know, Aunt May's really old, so like, you could've just maybe let her go, but I guess not. And if you're wondering why he didn't ask other people for help here, who you know are superheroes, magic users, scientists, and or doctors, there's some people I'm sure that are all of those things, he actually did ask them for help, and apparently no one else could help him. This was a truly terrible comics moment, but it happened and it resulted in Peter's and Mary Jane's lives forever being changed. Number 4. Thought dead, then kidnapped. Mary Jane was on a flight to a shoot when the plane exploded and she was presumed dead. For over a year in comics, MJ was simply a ghost haunting Peter, who truly believed that she was actually gone. In reality, Mary Jane had been kidnapped by a mutant stalker who was obsessed with her and with becoming Spider-Man himself, known only as Stalker. It was revealed that this villain was a mutant who planned to use their telepathic powers to, in essence, become Peter and take over his life. Mary Jane was kept locked away and kidnapped by this villain for months before Spider-Man finally came to rescue her. In the end, she and Peter got away after she managed to knock out her captor using a chair to basically hit Spidey, which, because Stalker was psychically linked to him, hurt him more than it did Peter, who obviously is much more resilient, I'm sure, than Stalker. The whole thing, I feel like, should have really taken more of a toll on just about everyone involved, but hey, comics, so I feel like we never really talk about it again. Number 3. Terrorized by Venom. One of the moments that caused a lot of grief and trauma for MJ took place when she was completely terrified by Venom's appearance and presence. Not only was MJ left almost broken by the experience, almost perpetually and severely afraid of the villain, but this wouldn't be the last that she'd see of Venom either. Venom has not only terrified MJ in the main continuity, but he has also done so in alternate universes too, where he has targeted both her and other members of Peter's and generally also MJ's family together. Due to her intensely negative relationship with the symbiote, fans even were initially triggered at the sight of the black suit when we were given a variant cover featuring MJ bonded with the symbiote in place of Eddie Brock. This was intended to celebrate MJ, but it definitely stirred up some mixed feelings for many of her fans. Although it is a cool variant, it does look cool, I will say. Number 2. Assassination Attempt. We all talk about when Peter hit Mary Jane in the midst of a fight between him and Ben, but few people seem to recall that Peter also tried to kill Mary Jane during the events of the Clone Saga. So it wasn't necessarily his fault here, as he was programmed, brainwashed into doing so by the Jackal, but it still makes for a horrific experience for Mary Jane either way, who at the time was also pregnant with their child. Terrified, she was forced to flee from Peter, running for her life and seeking help from anyone she could find, any of Spider-Man's hopefully superpowered allies. Basically, the Clone Saga was just a really hard time for MJ and pretty much everyone else. It was just a hard time. Number 1. Baby was taken. One of the worst things to ever happen to MJ was when she was tricked into believing that her and Peter's baby was born stillborn. Mary Jane had a complicated and challenging pregnancy, and it was even implied that her baby would be born with powers, or develop them over time, possibly even being born a mutant. While out at a restaurant, Allison Mongrain, working for Norman Osborn, slipped something into Mary Jane's food, which resulted in her going into labor. She was then told the baby that she gave birth to was was actually stillborn, when in reality the baby was not dead but lived and was kidnapped by Mongrain and delivered to Osborn, who paid her to take the baby away to Europe, never to be seen or heard from again. It's later suggested the child perished, but there isn't really much explanation as to why Osborn did this, especially so secretly, without MJ and Peter really ever learning of what truly happened till much later. It more feels like this was part of an unresolved plot that someone was writing, and the writers just really didn't want the young couple to start a family, so they were like, I guess we'll just leave this, and their baby's gone. The end. Wow, some of these are seriously pretty terrible, especially MJ believing that she gave birth to a stillborn baby when she didn't. That's messed up. And this is only some of the traumatizing experiences that MJ has lived through across the multiverse and throughout comic book history. What do you think are some of the worst things that have happened to MJ? Let us know in the comments below. Till next time, this is Top 10 Nerd, and I'm your host Amanda McKnight, reminding you to stay nerdy, YouTube.